They said the winter would be over before it began. They said the Red Army would collapse within weeks, that Moscow would fall before the snow. They said Russia's vastness could be conquered with tanks, planes, and lightning speed. In June 1941, the German generals laughed at the thought of winter because they believed there would be no winter. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it was the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and nearly all the might of the Wehrmacht surged eastward into the Soviet Union. The goal was simple and terrifying: destroy the Red Army, capture Moscow, and end the war in the East before the year was out. It was supposed to be a campaign of weeks, not months, and certainly not years. For the first few months, it seemed unstoppable. German armored divisions sliced through Soviet defenses with frightening precision. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, cut off, and destroyed in vast pockets at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. The German High Command congratulated itself on a campaign more successful than any in history. Berlin celebrated. Newspapers called it the final struggle in the East. Hitler's generals boasted that one kick and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. To them, Russia was not a land to fear. It was a prize to be taken. But beneath that confidence, something was already going wrong. From the very start, logistics strained under the weight of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had never fought a campaign on such a scale. Its supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across primitive roads. Soviet infrastructure, railways, bridges, depots, had been destroyed by retreating forces. Fuel, ammunition, and food struggled to keep pace with the advancing tanks. Still, in the summer heat, few noticed. The tanks rolled on, the infantry marched, and Moscow drew closer. But the calendar kept turning. By late September 1941, the German Army Group Center, the force tasked with taking Moscow, was exhausted. Its soldiers had marched for months without rest. Their boots were worn thin, their vehicles battered. The roads had turned to mud as autumn rains swept across the plains. The rapid advance had slowed to a crawl. Yet the orders from Hitler were relentless. Forward. Moscow must fall. The operation was given a name: Typhoon. In early October, the Germans launched their final offensive toward the Soviet capital. At first, success came again. Vast Soviet formations were trapped near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. It seemed that the road to Moscow was open. German propaganda declared that the capital would fall within weeks. But while German soldiers fought through mud and rain, the temperature began to drop. The first snowflakes fell in mid-October, early, unexpected. Within days, the muddy roads froze solid, then turned slick with ice. Tanks began to break down. Engines refused to start. The men tried to laugh it off. They had no winter clothing, no antifreeze, and no fuel for warming fires. They were told that the campaign would be over before the real cold arrived. Yet each day, the cold deepened. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not beaten. Far from it. Though reeling from catastrophic losses, the Red Army regrouped under desperate command. Stalin called it the Great Patriotic War, and his orders were clear: Moscow must be held at all costs. Factories were evacuated east, beyond the Ural Mountains. Civilians dug trenches around the capital. Women, students, and old men joined the defense. And from the east, a new army was coming. Troops hardened by the Siberian winter, equipped for snow, trained for the cold. In late November, the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Moscow. German troops could see the spires of the city through their field glasses. They believed victory was near. But the closer they came, the more the weather turned against them. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Rifle bolts froze solid. Oil thickened like glue. Fuel turned to jelly. The men wrapped themselves in blankets, curtains, even horse hides to keep from freezing. The tanks, the pride of the German blitzkrieg, began to die one by one. Their engines seized, their tracks cracked, their guns jammed. The mighty Wehrmacht, the army that had crushed Europe in 2 years, now stood helpless before a foe it could not fight: the Russian winter. And still, the order came from Hitler: advance. Moscow is within reach, but it wasn't. The Red Army was waiting. As December arrived, the snow buried the roads, the rivers froze solid, and the dream of a swift victory over the Soviet Union died quietly in the frozen fields outside Moscow. The German generals had laughed at winter. Now winter was laughing back. By December 1941, the German advance of Moscow had slowed to a crawl, and then to nothing at all. The Wehrmacht's mighty columns, stretched across hundreds of miles, were now immobilized by cold, exhaustion, and disbelief. The great promise of blitzkrieg had turned into a frozen nightmare. The men had never experienced anything like it. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Oil congealed inside engines. Machine guns froze after a few bursts. Food was frozen solid, so hard that soldiers had to thaw it over fires just to eat. Their breath crystallized in the air. The German army had gone to war without winter uniforms. Its planners, confident that Moscow would fall before October, had ordered only summer gear. Now men wrapped themselves in anything they could find. Bed sheets, newspapers, women's scarves taken from abandoned homes. One soldier wrote in his diary, "Every night another comrade does not wake up. They sit in the snow, rifle across their knees, eyes open, and they are gone." The cold was an enemy more merciless than any Soviet division. Meanwhile, inside Moscow, the situation was equally desperate, but not broken. Stalin refused to abandon the city. He had moved many government offices to Kuibyshev, but he himself stayed in the Kremlin. His message to the people was defiance. He told them, Moscow will be defended to the last drop of blood. Thousands of civilians worked day and night to fortify the city. Trenches were dug around the outskirts. Anti-tank obstacles, dragon's teeth, were set up along major roads. The Moscow metro became a bomb shelter. Children carried water, women loaded ammunition, and workers repaired tanks right in the city squares. Even the churches, long suppressed by the regime, reopened to bless the defenders. Faith, whether in God, country, or mere survival, was all that was left. Then something unexpected happened. From the vastness of the East, fresh Soviet divisions began to arrive. Troops trained in Siberia, accustomed to the cold, wearing white camouflage and fur-lined uniforms. Stalin had held them back for one reason: fear of a Japanese attack in the Far East. But his spies in Tokyo had confirmed Japan's plans lay elsewhere, in the Pacific, not Siberia. Now those Siberian soldiers were unleashed. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army counterattacked. The German generals, already at their limits, were stunned. Soviet T-34 tanks, with wide tracks built for snow, moved through terrain that stopped German panzers dead. Ski troops glided through forests, striking supply lines and ambush points. Artillery thundered from the frozen hills, shaking the ice from the trees. A blizzard swept across the front. Visibility fell to near zero. The Soviets advanced through the storm, using it as cover. German sentries froze in their posts, unable to see or hear until the enemy was upon them. The counter-offensive rolled west like a tide of ice and fire. Towns that had fallen to the Germans only weeks before, Klin, Kalinin, Tula, were liberated one by one. For the first time since the start of the war, the Red Army was on the offensive. In Berlin, shock turned to panic. The propaganda of a quick victory shattered. Hitler, enraged and humiliated, refused to allow retreats. He issued his infamous Stand Fast order. No withdrawals, no surrender, no step backward. For many German divisions, it was a death sentence. They dug in where they stood, trying to hold their positions with frost-bitten hands and half-dead horses. Some burned their vehicles just to stay warm. Medical units ran out of morphine. Men lost fingers, ears, noses, their bodies turning black with frostbite. The same generals who had once laughed at Russia's winter now begged for mercy from it. By mid-December, the Soviet counterattack had pushed the Germans 100 kilometers back from Moscow. The myth of German invincibility was broken. Newspapers in London, Washington, and even neutral capitals wrote of a miracle, the winter that had saved Russia. But the truth was more complex. Winter alone had not stopped the Germans. It had only exposed the flaw in their arrogance. It was the resilience of the Soviet people, soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike, that had turned the tide. For the first time since 1939, Hitler's army had failed to achieve its objective. For the first time, it had been forced to retreat. The German generals had thought themselves masters of war. But war has no masters, only survivors. And in the winter of 1941, on the frozen fields outside Moscow, the survivors were wearing fur hats and red stars. The retreat from Moscow was not an orderly withdrawal, it was chaos frozen in motion. Across hundreds of kilometers, the once proud Wehrmacht stumbled backward through blizzards, chased by an army it had believed broken. The German soldiers who had marched toward Moscow as conquerors were now fighting simply to stay alive. The Soviet counteroffensive struck with precision and fury. Siberian divisions led the charge, their commanders hardened by years of fighting in the Far East. They wore white snowsuits that blended with the landscape, moving unseen until it was too late. German soldiers later said the snow itself seemed to come alive, that the enemy materialized out of the storm. General Heinz Guderian, once one of Hitler's most trusted tank commanders, wrote bitterly, "The cold is our worst enemy. Engines freeze. Oil turns solid. Men cannot dig trenches. The ground is like iron. The Russians attack in the storm, and our rifles fail us. The front is collapsing." For the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's officers were arguing openly with Hitler. They demanded withdrawal, reorganization, anything that would allow them to survive the winter. But the Führer refused. He ordered his divisions to stand their ground. Victory or death, he declared, and death came swiftly. German units found themselves encircled in snowbound villages. Soviet artillery thundered day and night, pulverizing any defense that dared to hold. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, froze where they stood, their bodies stiff beside the wagons they could no longer pull. Tanks were abandoned when their engines cracked in the cold. Machine guns jammed. Even the vaunted 88mm guns, the pride of the German arsenal, failed to fire in sub-zero temperatures. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the sky, could barely operate. Wings iced over before takeoff. Fuel froze in tanks. Pilots wrapped scarves around their faces to keep from freezing inside the cockpit. The same Air Force that had bombed Moscow in July was now powerless to save the men below. In contrast, the Red Army adapted. Its soldiers wore layers of wool and fur. Their T-34 tanks rolled effortlessly across snow and mud, their wide tracks spreading weight evenly. Soviet mechanics drained engine oil each night and warmed it over fires before morning, ensuring their machines would start. The balance of power had shifted, not because the Soviets had more, but because they understood where they were. And behind the front, Moscow still lived. Factories once threatened by invasion now worked without pause. Women and teenagers produced tanks, rifles, and shells in unheated halls. Every hammer blow was an act of defiance. The sound of industry echoed through the capital, a heartbeat that never stopped. Stalin's propaganda machine turned the freezing struggle into legend. Posters declared, "The winter is our ally." Songs on the radio spoke of courage, not despair. The story of the Soviet resistance spread around the world. Allied newspapers hailed the defense of Moscow as the first major defeat for Hitler. But for those in the snow, there was no glory, only survival. One German officer wrote in his diary, "The snow falls endlessly. The wind never stops. We burn furniture, doors, anything that will burn. The men's feet are black with frostbite. The living envy the dead." Another simply wrote, "Moscow is hell." In the villages between Smolensk and Kaluga, whole regiments froze in their trenches. When Soviet patrols passed days later, they found them seated in silence, rifles in their hands, ice on their faces, their uniforms glazed white. This was the reality of the stand-fast order. Meanwhile, inside Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the atmosphere was turning poisonous. Reports from the front contradicted his delusions of victory. His generals pleaded for a retreat. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was dismissed for suggesting it. Guderian was next. Anyone who spoke of withdrawal was branded a coward. But the truth was undeniable. The German advance had failed. The men who had laughed at Russia's winter now understood its silence. The kind of silence that swallows sound, hope, and reason alike. The Wehrmacht had not just lost a battle, it had lost the illusion of invincibility. As January 1942 dawned, the Red Army pressed forward, retaking ground that had seemed lost forever. The cities of Kaluga, Maloyaroslavets, and Mojaisk were liberated. For the first time since the start of the war, Soviet soldiers could look west and believe that victory, though distant, was possible. But even as they advanced, the cost was staggering. The Red Army was bleeding as it triumphed. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion tore through its ranks as mercilessly as they did through the German lines. For every kilometer gained, hundreds of men fell, buried in snow that hid the horror beneath. By February, both sides were locked in exhaustion. The Soviet counterattack had run its course. The Germans had not been destroyed, but they had been broken. The front stabilized, but the myth of German perfection had cracked forever. They had believed winter was only weather. They learned it was a weapon, one that did not forgive arrogance. And for the first time, in the long war that still had years to run, the question was not when Germany would win, but whether it could survive. The road from Moscow back to Smolensk was lined with wreckage, a frozen museum of defeat, charred trucks, shattered panzers, broken sledges. The snow buried everything except the twisted shapes of war. In the distance, the black skeletons of villages stood against a white horizon. What had once been Hitler's spearhead toward conquest was now an army limping through oblivion. It was here, amid the endless cold, that the German generals finally faced the truth. Their campaign had been built on arrogance, on the false promise that speed and steel could defeat distance and nature. "Russia will fall before the first snow," Hitler had said. But by the time the snow came, it was his own army that was falling, not in battle, but in silence. German equipment had been designed for the fields of France, not the wilderness of the East. Tanks that once thundered across Europe were now frozen monuments. Their engines refused to start, their oil thick as tar. Crews built fires under the hulls to warm them, only to watch them ignite. Lubricants froze, optics cracked, machine guns jammed. Even the simple act of loading ammunition became torture. Shells stuck to bare skin, ripping it away like paper. One soldier wrote home, "The cold eats through everything. Through boots, through coats, through hope." The Red Army, by contrast, was learning to fight smarter. The Soviets understood that this was their home, their climate, their fight. Their soldiers wore padded coats and felt boots. They slept in dugouts lined with straw, warmed their weapons inside their coats, and melted snow for water when supplies ran out. The turning point was not a single battle, but a series of them. The slow crushing of German positions along the Moscow line. Soviet generals like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev coordinated attacks from multiple directions, encircling isolated German units and slicing through their flanks. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, could not respond everywhere at once. In mid-December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive gathered momentum. Entire German divisions fell back toward Rzhev and Vyazma. The retreat turned to panic. Horses slipped on the ice, artillery was abandoned. Soldiers froze where they stood. For every kilometer they gave up, more of their comrades were left behind, dead or dying. But retreat was forbidden. Hitler had issued his infamous no-step-back order, demanding that every position be held to the last man. Commanders who ignored the order faced dismissal or execution. Obedience became suicide. At the village of Klin, a German infantry regiment surrounded by Soviet tanks called for permission to withdraw. The answer came in a single sentence: "Hold your ground." By morning, the regiment no longer existed. Across the front, the same story repeated. Whole companies vanished overnight, buried in snowdrifts or consumed by Soviet artillery. The few survivors who stumbled back through the blizzard carried stories of horror. Frozen comrades standing upright, weapons in hand, eyes glazed with ice. And still, the Führer refused to listen. Inside the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler raged against his generals. He accused them of cowardice, betrayal, and weakness. "The will of one man," he declared, "is worth more than 1,000 plans." But the will of one man could not fight the winter. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels tried to turn disaster into theater. Propaganda broadcasts described the heroic stand of German soldiers in the snow, the invincible spirit of the Aryan warrior. But the letters reaching home told a different story. Mothers received notes written in shaking hands, describing nights without fire, rations of frozen bread, comrades lost to frostbite and despair. For the first time, families in Germany began to sense the truth. The war that had seemed distant was now devouring their sons. By January of 1942, temperatures plunged below -40. The front froze solid. Trenches turned to tunnels of ice. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags and prayed for morning. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Medics amputated fingers and toes by lantern light. The smell of gangrene mixed with the cold air, sharp and unforgettable. And through it all, the Soviets advanced. The Red Army had learned to coordinate infantry, armor, and air power on a scale unimaginable just months before. Yakovlev fighters swept over the lines, hunting down German reconnaissance planes. T-34 tanks, their engines warm and reliable, rolled through the snow where panzers could not. Soviet artillery barrages pounded German positions with relentless rhythm, a thunder that never ceased. General Zhukov, orchestrating the defense and counterattack from Moscow, wrote later, "The enemy had underestimated not just our army, but our people. Every village became a fortress, every peasant a soldier. Behind the lines, civilians fought their own war, digging trenches, carrying ammunition, feeding soldiers from what little they had. Entire towns volunteered to rebuild roads and bridges in the snow so supply convoys could pass. Even children worked in factories, assembling parts for tanks and rifles. It was not just the Red Army that saved Moscow, it was the nation itself." By February, the once invincible Wehrmacht had been pushed back nearly 200 kilometers. Its dream of conquering the Soviet capital lay buried beneath snow and corpses. The German generals who had laughed at Russia's winter now begged for mercy from it. They had brought the finest army in the world into the heart of the East, and the East had swallowed it whole. But the story was not over. Moscow had been saved, but the war was far from won. Both armies were shattered, both nations bleeding. Spring would bring mud, summer would bring new offensives, and the struggle for the soul of Europe would continue. The winter of 1941 had ended Hitler's illusion of invincibility, but it had also taught Stalin that the war would be longer and bloodier than anyone had imagined. The snow would melt, but the scars would remain. And as the rivers thawed and the earth turned to mud, a new question loomed over the Eastern Front. Could the Red Army, exhausted yet unbroken, carry the fight west, or would Germany return stronger, more ruthless than before? When the first thaws of spring 1942 came to the Russian plains, they revealed a graveyard. Under melting snow lay the bones of men and the wrecks of machines that had once symbolized unstoppable conquest. The earth was soaked with oil, blood, and melted frost. A landscape shaped not just by battle, but by pride brought low. The Wehrmacht had survived the winter, but just barely. The soldiers who stumbled out of that inferno were gaunt, frostbitten, and silent. They had lost 500,000 men since June 1941. Thousands more were crippled or dying in field hospitals. And yet, in Berlin, Hitler refused to call it retreat. To the world, it was a tactical withdrawal. To his soldiers, it was a miracle they were alive at all. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler began planning the next campaign. Operation Blue, the drive toward the south. His new goal was not Moscow, but the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that guarded the Volga, Stalingrad. The name itself carried symbolic weight. To destroy Stalin's city, he believed, would shatter Soviet morale and secure the resources to fuel 1,000 more tanks. His generals were hesitant. They had seen what the winter had done to their armies, but Hitler no longer trusted them. He believed in destiny, not caution. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin saw the same map, though drawn in blood rather than ink. He knew the German army would come again, and this time it would come with vengeance. So he ordered what would become one of the largest mobilizations in human history. New armies were raised, new factories built, and whole cities relocated beyond the reach of German bombers. The Soviet Union turned itself into a single weapon. Women worked 12-hour shifts in munitions plants. Farmers harvested grain in bomb craters. Trains carried tanks instead of passengers. Every resource, every heartbeat was poured into resistance. By summer 1942, the front had shifted southward. The snows of Moscow gave way to the steppe. Rolling fields, blazing sun, and the endless dust of the Don River basin. German tanks rolled once more, their tracks leaving black scars across the grasslands. The offensive advanced with terrifying speed. Town after town fell, Soviet divisions shattered, and the Red Army seemed on the brink of collapse. But the lesson of Moscow had not been forgotten. The Soviets no longer tried to stop the Germans head-on. They bent, retreated, and traded space for time, drawing the enemy deeper, always deeper, into the vastness of the steppe. By August, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had reached the Volga. The target was in sight, Stalingrad, a city of factories and tenements, stretched like a scar along the riverbank. It was here that Hitler's dream of victory would meet its reckoning. The Germans entered the city with confidence. Their air force reduced entire districts to rubble in a single week. Firestorms swept through neighborhoods, consuming everything. They expected quick victory, but what they found instead was a nightmare. Every building became a fortress, every street a battlefield. Soviet snipers hid in the ruins. Machine gunners fired from basements, stairwells, and sewers. The Red Army fought block by block, floor by floor, meter by meter. There were no front lines, only chaos. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Stalingrad is not a city anymore. It is hell, and the men who fight here are ghosts." In the midst of the inferno, the Soviet commander Vasily Chukov took charge of the defense. His strategy was brutal simplicity, hold at all costs. He ordered his men to fight so close to the enemy that German artillery couldn't distinguish friend from foe, a tactic the soldiers called hugging the enemy. It worked. The Luftwaffe's bombs killed thousands, but the front barely moved. The city that had already been destroyed became its own shield. By November, the Germans had captured most of Stalingrad, but the Soviets still held narrow pockets along the river. Hitler declared victory publicly. "The Soviet resistance," he said, "is broken." But it was not broken. It was waiting. Then on November 19th, 1942, as the first snow fell again, the Soviet counteroffensive began. From the north and south, two massive Soviet armies struck. Not at the city itself, but at its flanks, where Romanian and Italian divisions guarded the lines. Within days, those forces collapsed. The Red Army poured through the gaps, advancing across the frozen steppe and meeting west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Inside the encirclement, Paulus and his men were stunned. They had expected reinforcements, not isolation. Hitler ordered them to stand fast. "The army will be supplied by air," he promised. But the Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Food ran out, fuel vanished, ammunition dwindled. The winter returned, colder, harsher than before. The once proud Sixth Army began to starve and freeze, just as their comrades had outside Moscow a year earlier. German radio operators began to send desperate messages. Situation hopeless. No supplies. Men dying, but there would be no rescue. Outside the encirclement, Field Marshal von Manstein attempted a relief operation. His tanks advanced within 40 kilometers of the trapped army, then halted. The Soviets struck again, and the chance was lost forever. Inside Stalingrad, men ate horseflesh and boiled leather. The wounded froze to death in unheated cellars. Entire regiments vanished into the snow. By late January 1943, Paulus requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused. "You must fight to the last man and bullet," he ordered. When Paulus finally capitulated on February 2nd, he did so not as a field marshal of victory, but as a prisoner of fate. Out of 300,000 men who entered Stalingrad, barely 90,000 were taken prisoner. Only a few thousand would ever see Germany again. The battle had turned the tide of the entire war. For the first time, the German army had been decisively defeated. The myth of invincibility was gone, buried in the ashes of a city that refused to die. And so, the laughter that had echoed on the road to Moscow was silenced once more. This time, by the ghosts of Stalingrad. But the story of the Eastern Front was far from over. The German army still occupied vast territories, and both sides knew that what came next would decide the fate of Europe itself. As spring approached, Hitler vowed revenge. His new target, the city of Kursk, where he promised to destroy the Red Army once and for all. The stage was set for the largest tank battle in history. The winter of 1943 melted into a spring of uneasy triumph. Across the vast Eastern Front, the Red Army pushed westward through mud and ruin, chasing an enemy that refused to break. For the first time since 1941, the Germans were retreating, but not defeated. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler seethed. The disaster at Stalingrad had not only shattered an army, it had humiliated the entire Reich. The myth of German invincibility was gone. The world now saw that the Wehrmacht could bleed, and Hitler, obsessed with vengeance and pride, swore to reclaim that image. At his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, he summoned his generals. Maps covered the tables, arrows cut across the front lines. His voice rose above the murmurs of dissent. "We will strike again," he said. "We will destroy the Red Army at Kursk." Kursk, a name that would soon be carved into history. It lay at the center of a massive bulge in the Soviet front lines, a salient that extended 150 miles westward. To Hitler, it looked like a perfect opportunity, a trap waiting to be sprung. His plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was simple in theory, but deadly in ambition. A two-pronged assault that would cut off the salient, encircle the Soviet forces inside, and restore the Wehrmacht's dominance. But his generals were wary. Field Marshal von Manstein, still one of Germany's most capable commanders, warned that the Soviets had learned from every defeat. He urged postponement, fearing that the element of surprise was gone. Hitler refused. For months, Germany prepared. The best divisions were gathered, the elite Waffen-SS units, Panzer Grenadiers, and thousands of tanks, including the new Tiger and Panther models. They were the pride of German engineering, armed with powerful 88mm guns and thick armor. Hitler called them the weapons that will change the course of the war. Yet even as the Germans prepared their strike, the Soviets were watching and waiting. Thanks to an extensive network of spies and codebreakers, Stalin's intelligence service, the GRU, had already uncovered Hitler's plan. The Red Army knew when and where the blow would fall, and under the direction of General Georgy Zhukov, they turned Kursk into a fortress. For 2 months, hundreds of thousands of soldiers dug trenches. 8 defensive belts, each bristling with mines, barbed wire, and artillery. Over 500,000 mines were laid. Thousands of guns were positioned. Entire armies were buried beneath the earth, waiting. By July 1943, the stage was set. The Germans would attack from the north and south, attempting to pinch off the salient. The Soviets, entrenched and prepared, would meet them with a wall of steel. On July 5, 1943, at dawn, the earth trembled. The German offensive began with one of the largest artillery barrages in history, and the Soviets responded with one of their own. The sky lit up like a thunderstorm of fire. The ground shook as thousands of shells fell every minute. Then through the smoke, the tanks came. In the north, the German Ninth Army struck first. Tiger tanks led the charge, crushing barbed wire and trenches beneath their treads. But the Soviet defenses were deep. Minefields shredded the first wave, anti-tank guns opened fire, and Soviet soldiers held their ground with grim determination. In the south, near the small town of Prokhorovka, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps advanced. 3 of the most feared divisions in the German army, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. Their goal was to break through and link up with the northern force, trapping the Soviets inside the bulge. But the Red Army was ready. From hidden positions, Soviet T-34 tanks roared to life. They poured out of the ravines and forests, charging headlong into the German lines. What followed was chaos, the largest tank battle in history. Nearly 1,500 tanks clashed across the fields of Prokhorovka. The noise was deafening, steel crashing against steel, shells exploding at point-blank range. Dust and smoke blotted out the sun. Pilots flying overhead said it looked like the surface of another planet. The Germans, with their superior optics and armor, destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks. But the Soviets did not break. They charged again and again, closing the distance so the German long-range guns became useless. The battlefield turned into a storm of motion. Tanks ramming, tracks grinding, turrets blazing. One Soviet commander, Rotmistrov, later said, "It was not a battle, it was a slaughterhouse of iron." By the end of the day, the fields around Prokhorovka were a graveyard of machines. Hundreds of tanks lay burning, their crews gone. The Germans had advanced only a few kilometers. Their offensive had stalled. And then, in the west, news arrived that would seal their fate. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Hitler, furious and panicked, ordered divisions withdrawn from the Eastern Front to defend Italy. Operation Citadel, his grand counterstrike, was over. The initiative now belonged to the Soviets. What had begun as a German plan to restore the Reich's pride ended as its final gamble. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht would never again take the strategic offensive in the east. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, now surged forward. City by city, mile by mile, they pushed the invaders back. Orel, Kharkov, Smolensk, all fell in rapid succession. For the first time since 1941, Soviet soldiers crossed the Dnieper River, advancing into Ukraine. The tide had turned for good. And yet, even in defeat, Hitler refused to yield. His armies would fight on, through another winter, through the ruins of cities, through the collapse of hope itself. But as autumn 1943 settled over the steppe, one truth had become clear to both sides. The road to Berlin had begun. The fall of 1943 swept across the Eastern Front like a storm of reckoning. The Red Army, newly confident and reinforced, pressed westward with relentless force. The Germans, once masters of maneuver, were now fighting for survival. The land itself seemed exhausted. Villages lay in ashes, roads were scarred with tank tracks, and forests were filled with the wreckage of war. Each step forward was paid for with blood. But for the first time in 2 years, the Red Army was advancing, not retreating. In Berlin, Hitler raged behind closed doors. He blamed his generals for the failure at Kursk, dismissing their caution as cowardice. Yet even as he shouted about betrayal, the facts were undeniable. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The German army had lost hundreds of thousands of men in 1943. Entire divisions were gone, consumed by the vastness of Russia. Replacements were scarce, fuel was short, and the Luftwaffe no longer ruled the sky. The Soviet Air Force, once mocked as weak, now prowled the front in growing strength. Still, Hitler refused to accept retreat. Every inch of ground, he declared, must be held to the last man. His generals knew it was madness. The Eastern Front stretched nearly 2,000 miles, and Germany no longer had the men to defend it. But defiance had become the Führer's last strategy. By late 1943, the Red Army reached the banks of the Dnieper River, a natural barrier running through the heart of Ukraine. The Germans turned it into a defensive line, fortifying the western bank and destroying bridges to slow the Soviet advance. But Stalin wanted more than just another victory. He wanted liberation of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. The city had been under German occupation since 1941. Its people had suffered through executions, forced labor, and starvation. For the Soviets, retaking Kiev was not just strategic, it was symbolic. In November 1943, under gray skies and freezing rain, the Red Army began its assault. The crossing of the Dnieper was one of the most daring operations of the war. Soviet engineers built rafts and makeshift bridges under constant German fire. Men paddled across the icy river with their rifles wrapped in oilcloth. Many drowned before reaching the far bank, but those who made it clung to the shore, clawing their way into shallow trenches. Then, with artillery thunder rolling behind them, the full force of the Soviet offensive began. German units fought stubbornly, their machine guns raking the crossing points, but the Soviets poured across in waves. Within days, they had established bridgeheads and began pushing into the outskirts of Kiev. On November 6, 1943, the Red Army entered the city. German forces, realizing they could not hold, withdrew west. The liberation of Kiev was complete. After 2 long years under occupation, the Ukrainian capital was free. Crowds filled the streets, cheering through tears. Soviet soldiers marched among ruins, greeted by civilians who had survived the unimaginable. For many, it was the first real glimpse of hope since the war began. But victory carried a terrible price. The land they had reclaimed was scarred beyond recognition. Millions of homes were destroyed. Entire towns had been wiped from the map. In some places, there were no civilians left to greet the liberators, only silence and ash. The Soviet people had endured suffering on a scale the world had never seen. Yet even as they buried their dead, they rebuilt their resolve. They knew the war was far from over. Ahead lay Belarus, the Baltics, Poland, and beyond them, Germany itself. Winter returned once more, the third winter of the war for the Germans on the Eastern Front. The lessons of 1941 had not been forgotten. German soldiers dug in early, fortifying their positions, wrapping themselves in furs and straw, salvaging whatever they could. They remembered the cold that had frozen their engines and taken their comrades. They would not be caught unprepared again. But nature cared little for preparation. The cold came back like vengeance. In December 1943, temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Winds howled across the plains, fuel thickened in the tanks, boots froze to the ground, and rifles jammed with ice. German supply lines, already stretched thin, could not keep up. And unlike in 1941, the Soviets were ready for winter. They had proper clothing, winterized machinery, and experience. They struck relentlessly, launching attacks through blizzards and across frozen rivers. The Red Army had learned how to fight in the cold, and the Germans, once so proud of their discipline, now faced the same nightmare they had inflicted 2 years before. By early 1944, the Eastern Front had shifted irrevocably. What had once been the heart of Hitler's empire in the East was now a battlefield of retreat. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, its ranks thinned by losses in Russia, its supplies drained by Allied bombing in the West, its morale breaking. The soldiers still fought bravely, but they knew the truth. Germany could no longer win, yet still they fought on. At the same time in the West, the Allies were preparing for their great return, the invasion of France. Hitler now faced war on two fronts once again, just as he had feared. For the generals who had once laughed at winter, the irony was complete. Their armies had marched into the Soviet Union in 1941, believing the campaign would last only months. Now in 1944, those same men stood knee-deep in snow, hundreds of miles from home, staring east toward a horizon filled with smoke and memory. And beyond that horizon, the Red Army was coming. In the coming months, the front would erupt in fire once more. The Soviets would launch an offensive that would shatter what remained of the German army. A blow so massive it would sweep across Eastern Europe and break the last illusion of victory. The laughter had ended. Now came the reckoning. By the spring of 1944, the snow began to thaw, and with it, the last illusions of German victory melted into the mud. The Eastern Front, once the pride of Hitler's empire, had turned into a graveyard of ambition. Every forest, every riverbank, every shattered village was a monument to the failure of the invasion that was supposed to last 6 weeks. The Red Army stood ready. Its numbers had swelled to unimaginable strength. Over 6 million soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks, artillery guns, and aircraft. Behind them stood a nation that had learned to forge steel faster than the enemy could destroy it. In Moscow, Stalin and his generals prepared for what would become one of the most devastating military operations in human history, Operation Bagration. The plan was simple in its ambition and terrible in its scale: to destroy Germany's Army Group Center, the same force that had led the drive on Moscow 3 years earlier. If successful, it would break the backbone of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front and open the road to Berlin. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years to the day since Operation Barbarossa began, the Red Army struck. At dawn, Soviet artillery unleashed a storm that shook the earth. Thousands of guns opened fire in unison, pounding German positions with a ferocity that defied belief. The barrage rolled on for hours, lighting the horizon in an unbroken blaze. Then came the tanks, and behind them, the infantry. The Germans were overwhelmed. Entire divisions vanished in days. Their defensive lines, thought to be unbreakable, were torn apart like paper. In Minsk, encircled German troops fought desperately before being crushed. Army Group Center, over 400,000 men, ceased to exist. By July, the Red Army was advancing faster than at any point in the war. Town after town fell. Smolensk, Vitebsk, Orsha, Minsk. Names that had once marked the German advance now became markers of their retreat. The Wehrmacht was collapsing in the east. For every tank they managed to repair, the Soviets built 10. For every man lost, the Soviet Union found 3 more to take his place. The imbalance was no longer just strategic, it was existential. In Berlin, Hitler refused to believe the reports. He screamed at his generals, accusing them of cowardice, betrayal, even treason. "No retreat," he ordered, pounding his fists on the table. "Stand and fight to the last bullet." But bullets could not stop what was coming. The German soldiers, who had once laughed at the Russian winter, were now trapped in a summer inferno. Soviet tanks rolled across the plains like a tide of iron. Their engines roared through the dust, cutting through collapsing lines. In the chaos, German officers tried to organize counterattacks, but their units were shadows. Under strength, out of fuel, out of hope. The irony was bitter. 3 years earlier, these same men had mocked the Soviet soldiers as inferior. Poorly trained, poorly equipped, and easy to kill. Now they faced an army that had learned from every defeat, an army that had turned survival itself into a weapon. By August, the Red Army had advanced over 400 miles, one of the fastest and most complete military collapses in history. The Germans had been driven out of most of Belarus, and the road to Poland was open. For the first time, Soviet troops crossed the pre-war borders of the USSR. Every step west was vengeance, not the blind rage of 1941, but cold, relentless determination. They were coming for Berlin, and nothing would stop them. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, the Allies had landed in Normandy. Hitler now faced the nightmare he had always feared, a two-front war. From the beaches of France to the forests of Belarus, the Reich was being crushed between 2 advancing tides. In the east, German officers wrote grim reports to Berlin. "Our forces are disintegrating. Communications have collapsed. The enemy is everywhere." Yet Hitler refused to move reserves from the west. He was obsessed with holding ground, with not repeating the retreat of 1918. He ordered his men to fight where they stood, even as they froze, burned, or starved. The soldiers obeyed, not because they believed in victory, but because they feared the alternative. To surrender meant capture by the Red Army, and for many Germans, that meant death or imprisonment in the endless East. So they fought on, even when their tanks had no fuel, even when their guns had no shells. But the war had already passed the point of saving. By the end of 1944, the once proud Wehrmacht was a shadow of itself. Its finest generals were dead, dismissed, or disillusioned. Its tanks, once symbols of German might, lay frozen and abandoned on roads that stretched back toward the homeland. The laughter of the early days, the arrogance of 1941, had turned into silence broken only by the wind across the ruins. In the villages of Belarus and Ukraine, children played among the wrecks of tanks that had once seemed unstoppable. Their fathers had returned from the front, or not at all. For them, the mighty panzer divisions were not legends but relics, monuments to a hubris that had been buried in snow and mud. And as the Red Army marched westward, its soldiers began to believe something that would have been unthinkable in 1941, that the war would end not in Moscow nor on the Volga, but in Berlin itself. The frost that had once frozen German tanks outside Moscow had thawed, but the lesson remained. It was not the snow that defeated the Wehrmacht. It was the arrogance that led them there. Still, before the final reckoning came, one more winter would fall, and with it, the last great battles of the Eastern Front. The tide had turned, now the end was coming. The winter of 1944-45 was not like the one that had stopped the Germans 3 years earlier. This time, it was the Soviets who marched through the snow, their engines strong, their tanks warm, their spirits unbroken. The frozen fields that had once been symbols of suffering were now roads to victory. The Red Army stood on the banks of the Vistula River, just 70 kilometers from Warsaw, staring west toward Germany. Beyond that river lay the heart of the Reich, Berlin, the city that had started it all. But even as the end neared, the war refused to die quietly. Hitler, secluded in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, raged against his generals. He issued orders to imaginary divisions, demanded counterattacks that could no longer be made, and spoke of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. The reality outside his walls was very different. The German army was exhausted. Its tanks, once symbols of power, were now monuments to futility, stuck in the ice or abandoned on the roads. Fuel shortages crippled every movement. Many units fought with horses again, just as their fathers had done in the First World War. And still they fought, not for victory, but for survival, for the chance to delay the inevitable for one more day. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. It was the largest and fastest land operation of the war. Soviet tanks thundered across the frozen river under a storm of artillery. German defenses crumbled. Town after town fell with astonishing speed. In just 3 weeks, the Soviets advanced over 500 kilometers. The world had never seen such momentum. The Wehrmacht tried to resist, but it was like fighting a flood with bare hands. Soviet T-34s rolled over their positions, their tracks crushing the remains of the roads built by German engineers during the invasion years earlier. For the first time, German civilians saw the war coming home. They packed carts, fled in the snow, and watched as the land they had once considered untouchable was consumed by the very fire they had unleashed upon others. It was poetic justice, written in ice and flame. By late January, the Red Army reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The unthinkable had become real. The war that Hitler had begun as a triumph of will had turned into a slow, agonizing collapse. In Berlin, fear was everywhere. The once mighty city of empire was now a fortress under siege. Trenches were dug in the parks, anti-aircraft guns mounted on rooftops, and old men and boys pressed into uniform. The propaganda spoke of courage and destiny, but in the silence between speeches, the people knew the end was near. Meanwhile, the Red Army regrouped. They were close enough to see the glow of Berlin's lights on the horizon, but Stalin ordered a pause. He wanted the timing perfect. The Western Allies were pushing from the west, crossing the Rhine, and heading toward the heart of Germany. The final race for Berlin had begun. To the soldiers of the Soviet Union, this was not just a campaign, it was vengeance. For the cities burned, the families lost, the years of humiliation and struggle. One Soviet sergeant wrote in his diary, "We are not marching to conquer. We are marching to finish what they began." The winter was bitter, but the Soviets had learned from 1941. Their engines were covered against the cold, their tanks preheated, their supply lines efficient. The Germans, by contrast, were freezing again, trapped in the same nightmare they had once inflicted. Their tanks failed to start, their oil turned to sludge, their weapons jammed. It was as if the ghosts of the first winter outside Moscow had returned. But this time, they were on the Soviet side. The laughter that once filled German mess halls had vanished. The talk of the Russian winter as an excuse had become an unspoken shame. The generals no longer laughed. They no longer joked about the cold. They feared it, because now it followed them home. By February 1945, the Soviets surrounded the remnants of German resistance in East Prussia. The city of Königsberg, once proud, once imperial, became a cauldron of destruction. Entire divisions vanished there, swallowed by artillery and snow. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but silence. Across Poland, the Red Army liberated towns still scarred by the atrocities of occupation. The scale of destruction stunned even the victors. Villages burned to ash, cities flattened, rail lines twisted like wire. What the Germans had built for conquest had been turned into a landscape of loss. And yet, despite everything, the Soviet advance did not stop. In March, the thaw came. The snow melted into mud, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of millions of men preparing for the final assault. The Red Army now stood at the gates of the Reich. The same soldiers who had once dug trenches in the defense of Moscow now prepared to storm the capital of the empire that had tried to destroy them. 3 years earlier, the German generals had laughed at the Russian winter, certain that no army could withstand it. Now, as the spring of 1945 approached, it was clear who had endured and who had not. The frozen laughter of 1941 had melted into the silence of defeat, but one final act remained. A reckoning that would decide not just the fate of the war, but the future of Europe itself. The storm that began on the plains of Russia was now about to break over Berlin. April 1945. The war that had consumed the world was entering its final, merciless hour. Across the plains of eastern Germany, the Red Army gathered for its greatest assault, the final push toward Berlin. For 4 years, the Soviets had fought through fire and snow. From the walls of Moscow to the ruins of Stalingrad, from the fields of Kursk to the banks of the Vistula. Now all roads led to the heart of the Reich. The soldiers who had once defended their homes in rags now marched west with steel, vengeance, and memory. The German high command still clung to delusion. Hitler refused to surrender, convinced that Berlin would hold out, that new wonder weapons would turn the tide. But in reality, his empire was a hollow shell. His armies were shattered, his cities bombed to dust, and his people starving. The soldiers defending Berlin were a tragic reflection of the beginning of the war. Not the disciplined Wehrmacht of 1941, but a desperate mix of old men, wounded veterans, and teenage boys armed with rifles from another century. The Soviets launched their assault on April 16, 1945. It began with one of the largest artillery barrages in human history. Thousands of guns thundered at once, lighting the sky as if the sun had risen twice. The ground shook, forests caught fire, and the Oder River ran black with smoke. Then the tanks rolled forward. At the spearhead was the First Belarusian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the same general who had defended Moscow in 1941. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced in parallel, driving through Saxony and Lower Silesia. Between them stood the last obstacle, Berlin itself. The battle that followed was chaos made real. The city became a maze of rubble and flames. Every street, every building, every bridge became a fortress. Soviet tanks clashed with German Panthers at point-blank range, their shells carving holes through entire city blocks. Snipers haunted the ruins. Civilians huddled in basements as artillery shattered the world above them. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could barely send a handful of planes into the air. Fuel was gone. Pilots were gone. What remained were ghosts. The Germans had once laughed at the idea that General Winter could defeat them. Now they were facing something far colder: inevitability. By April 25th, the Soviets had encircled Berlin completely. The Western Allies, advancing from the Rhine, halted along the Elbe River by prior agreement. Berlin would be taken by the Red Army alone. Inside the city, Hitler raged and denied reality. He ordered phantom counterattacks, dismissed loyal generals, and condemned entire divisions that no longer existed. In the final week of April, as the city collapsed, he married his mistress, dictated his will, and prepared to die. Meanwhile, above ground, the Soviets advanced block by block. Entire units were wiped out in single streets. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. The Red Banner, the same one that had flown over the Kremlin during the dark days of 1941, was now being carried westward through fire and ruin. On April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops stormed the Reich Chancellery. In the early hours of the morning, Adolf Hitler ended his life in the bunker beneath Berlin. The news spread quietly, almost unbelievably. The man who had once promised a 1,000-year empire had not survived a dozen winters. By May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, the symbol of a victory paid for in unimaginable blood. The laughter of 1941 had long since vanished. The generals who had mocked the Russian winter were gone, their armies destroyed, their empire in ashes. The same cold that had frozen their tanks outside Moscow now swept through their abandoned cities. Their arrogance had met its final reckoning, not in the snow, but in the smoke of their own capital. For the Soviet Union, the victory was absolute, but it came at a terrible cost. More than 27 million Soviet citizens had died in the struggle. Cities were erased. Generations were lost. But the country had endured, and in endurance it had found strength. When the guns finally fell silent on May 9th, Victory Day in Moscow, the people filled the streets. They danced, they wept, they embraced strangers. For the first time in years, the night sky was lit not by fire, but by celebration. And yet, behind the triumph, there was silence. The silence of absence, of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. History often remembers wars as battles between machines, generals, and nations. But the truth of this war, of the frozen struggle outside Moscow, lies somewhere deeper. It lies in the endurance of those who refuse to yield, in the frost-bitten soldiers who held their rifles through the cold, in the factory workers who built tanks with their bare hands, in the men and women who believed, even in the darkest night, that the sun would rise again. When the German army first crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, its generals laughed at the idea that the weather, or the will of the Russian people, could stop them. By December, their laughter had frozen in their throats. And in the end, that frozen laughter became the sound of their defeat. The winter outside Moscow was not just a season, it was a judgment, a reminder that arrogance has limits, and that no empire, however powerful, can conquer the cold resolve of a people who refuse to surrender. The Germans had laughed at winter, but winter remembered, and when the snow fell again, it fell on their silence. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.